Hi guys, and welcome back. So we are back into our series on Elizabethan finance, and previously we've looked at the poor relief, we've looked at the mid-Tudor crisis and the legacy that she inherited. We've looked at the seminal moment, the turning point in terms of how she transformed poor relief. We looked at, in our last video, the idea of crown reforms and crown finances. And then, in the actual last video, we looked at the impact on people, the impact on industry, and the movement and migration and the idea of subsistence farming and all of those issues that kind of became apparent in the Elizabethan era. Now, on this kind of section of ordinary people, social and economic history combining as one, I'm just going to do a short video now on the standard of living. Okay, so I just wanted to touch on, what it's like for ordinary people. So in terms of just summarizing then the kind of the problem that we explained in the last couple of videos, we've got England being invested in the cloth industry, which has moved out of the towns and is no longer profitable. We've got the fact that fields have changed from arable to pastoral to support the cloth industry, which meant there is not enough food for the population. We've got there are too many migrants who have moved to the cities in search of work, which meant towns were now overcrowded with too few jobs, houses and food sources, which has created a huge problem for the poor to deal with. On the flip side of that, we've also got some individuals who have benefited: landlords, yeomen, merchants, industrialists and husbandmen who have managed to profit from increased trade, increased exploration, increased raw materials, and from owning land and making money from land. Now, as I've said previously, for the majority of those living in England at this time, the standard of living had dropped and occupied a very precarious existence on the edge of subsistence, so the very edge of the poverty line. There is a rise in crime and destitution when there is a year of poor harvest or drought, which shows just how unstable the financial system was. This is normally the reason for rebellion. Desperation drove many to discontent. That's something we need to remember when we think about concluding. We think about evaluating overall the success of the financial policy. Now, two areas I'm going to touch on just for some specific factual information that you can use in essays and things like that. I'm going to first talk about wages. So rents and wages remained comparatively stable despite the rise in inflation. This meant that actually the living wage has dropped. If wages stay static but inflation occurs, then the actual amount of money that you're able to have effectively becomes less, if that makes sense. I'm going to try and explain it to you. So rural workers are paid 4D a day from 1500 to 1550. During this time, there's a significant increase in the population and inflation. So if your rent or the cost of food has risen, but your wage has stayed the same, you can see that actually there is a growing gap between what you can afford. If you earn £4, but a loaf of bread started at 10 pence and is now £2, you can see actually what you have left is getting smaller across the time period. And that's what we call real wages. Now, that's why in today's society, wages often rise with inflation. So your wage might go up every year, regardless of promotion or anything like that, just by, a couple of percent, because to match the inflation of the economy. And that's especially the case if you work in government paid jobs like teachers, police force, things like that. So anyway, that's the real wage, and that does not happen. So people are still earning the same, but the cost of living has risen. Now, in terms of rents, in some areas, there's strong evidence to show that rents rose significantly across the Elizabethan period. In London, for example, some rents even doubled from 6D per acre to 13D per acre from 1570s compared to the 1530s. In other areas, there's evidence that rents remain static. So it's not kind of one case fits all in terms of this. However, there was definitely growing resentment over rents and wages, which would lead to popular discontent. Now, over the first half of the 16th century, the price of most goods rose sharply. Most serious rise in prices affected food such as grain and bread, cheese and meat. Now, this was caused in part by the rising population who put pressure on food demand. As we know, agriculture was not able to meet the growing demand, so food therefore gets more expensive. If there's not enough of it and more people want it, the product is going to rise in price. So by 1560, we actually have a rate of inflation at 200%. And as we know, wages are failing to rise with inflation. So we have a huge pressure and actually huge resentment over the inability to simply buy food. This in turn contributes to a damaged economy, which led to further unemployment and poverty. The government's reaction to all of this was to punish beggars, which clearly doesn't solve the problem. You know, we know that, and I think at the time government was starting to work this out as well, and shows just how naive they were to the real causes of the problem. Now remember, I just said 1560, the rate of inflation was 200%. Now think back to your poor relief and all of the legislation that was brought in. It wasn't until much later, really, in the 70s, and then really solidified by 1601 with the Poor Law, that this national system of welfare and help for the deserving poor was really, really solidified. So throughout this period, we obviously have extreme problems and hardship, and the government is kind of just fine-tuning and becoming aware of and starting to deal with the issue of how to help people. So yeah. Now, one thing to bear in mind, despite all of this, if we're trying to come to some conclusions about how effective Elizabeth's financial policy was, is that actually there are relatively few rebellions across the entirety of Elizabeth's reign. So the only substantial rebellion really is the Northern Earls in 1569, and this is mostly due to religious and political reasons rather than economic factors. Equally, you know, likewise, the only other difficult rebellion to deal with is in Ireland much later on, and that really is about the ownership of Ireland and the fact that the Irish want self-determination. They want to control Ireland themselves. So it doesn't really come down to the issue of poverty or finance particularly. Both of those rebellions, or in particular the Northern Earls Rebellion, is not joined by huge masses of the people, like for example the Pilgrimage of Grace was, where 30,000 people, most of them ordinary men and women, joined this rebellion out of sheer poverty and anger towards government. Now, that doesn't happen in Elizabeth's reign. And other than the London and the Oxfordshire riots, there were also very few other instances of significant rioting. Now, this shows that even with the financial crisis, the majority of English people found themselves to be quite happy or content with the efforts that Elizabethan England has taken in terms of poor relief, and that these were effective, and that actually perhaps the conditions people were living in under Elizabeth were not that far off from conditions expected of the time in Tudor England. So I think what's really important to note is that actually the legislation that's passed in terms of poor relief is very substantial in leading to a stability within England. We don't see the discontent, we don't see the rebellion, even though actually the financial condition of people is getting worse. And perhaps that is because for the first time there is provision for those people once their economic state has got worse. So while we might say there is perhaps failure in the financial system at not reforming and at not ensuring that those people are allowed to stay better off, once people are forced into poverty, there is now better provision for them and better care. Now, often those who rebel are because you are so desperate that there is no risk in rebelling anymore. And actually, I think what Elizabeth does is, through Cecil and her government with this poor law legislation, is they ensure that there is some provision for those who are destitute, for those who could be driven, to discontent. And I think that's why Elizabeth's reign in terms of financial policy, and especially poor relief, is so seminal to English history as a whole.